The other day, I did a video that compared the plant-based approach to beating diabetes versus the low-carb approach, and I shared some of the things we have in common, at least with Dr. Mark Furman, who is essentially plant-based, and yet he gets some things right for sure, in my estimation. Somebody left a comment under that video, and they wrote this: "Fantastic video," so appreciate that. He says, "I was doing plant-based, high-fruit, high-carb for 7 years, and I almost ended up in a wheelchair. I could not walk or stand much at all. So, mobility, powerfully affected, negatively affected. Could hardly stand, could hardly walk." He says, "After finding your videos, I decided to buy a blood sugar monitor, and my blood sugar was going over 180 to 200 after eating smoothies and fruit." Well, that doesn't surprise me. My guess would be most of America, probably much of the world, would have that same experience if they tested themselves after eating a lot of fruit or smoothies in this case, or both. Now, what's interesting, he says, "I had all the symptoms too. I was thirsty, had cotton mouth. My arms and legs were tingling all the time. I had to urinate every 15 minutes. I had UTI infections, high cholesterol, high bad cholesterol as well. But my doctor kept saying," this is the fascinating thing out of this comment. I mean, there's a lot of it that's interesting, but this one really floored me. "My doctor kept saying, 'You're not diabetic because your fasting glucose is okay.' She would not even order an A1C for me." To me, that's just almost criminal. I hate to say it because I love doctors. I support doctors. I tell people, check with your doctor, and people ask me individual advice. I won't give it to them. I'll say, talk to your doctor. But if I had a doctor and I was concerned about my blood sugar and I said, "Please give me an A1C," and they wouldn't do it, I'd find another doctor. Now, the good news is, at least in many parts of America, you can get an A1C done on your own with an independent lab. There are websites that can help you go through that process without even needing a doctor to get an A1C, and I've done that several times. But his doctor would not order an A1C. He said, "Your fasting glucose is okay, and for the non-diabetic range, that means under 126. Well, you could be at 122 with a fasting glucose, and that is just way too high." And he doesn't say what his fasting glucose was, but the doctor said, "Your fasting glucose is okay. No A1C for you, buddy." So he says, "I ordered a continuous glucose monitor, and it showed me the truth." Well, it's amazing what can happen when you get a little data going on about your body and how your body processes food and carbohydrates. So he orders an A1C test, and you can get those at pharmacies, and you can order them off Amazon, all kinds of different ways you can get them. In America, I can't say about your particular nation if you're not in America. But he gets an A1C test, a home test. He says, "Sure enough, I was 6.3 borderline diabetes." Well, 6.3 is not terrible. It's not good. It's something to be concerned about. But boy, I've heard them, 12, 15, 16, 17, I think is the highest I've heard of anyone with an A1C. So 6.3 is not horrible, but it's bad. You're going the wrong direction, and who knows where it'll be next year if you're pre-diabetic, which it is at this point. Now, he says, "I'm now in the 5.7 range. I'm able to walk 2 miles and ride my bike again." Now, to me, that's interesting, and that's kind of amazing, really. He went from 6.3 to 5.7. It's improvement for sure, but it's not a huge drop. And yet, the symptoms pretty much disappeared. He's now able to ride his bike. He's now able to walk. And apparently is doing so much better. He doesn't mention the neuropathy, but the way he writes this, I've been saying he, but this is a lady. I'm just looking at her name. I won't call her name, but this is a woman. Okay, so anyway, moves from 6.3 to 5.7, and suddenly the symptoms are either going away or they're vastly improving, judged by how excited this lady is. Can ride a bike now, can walk again. And she says, "Thank God for your videos, which helped me so much in the beginning. Much love to you." So it's amazing. High carb, high fruit, plant-based, 7 years, getting worse and worse, becoming pre-diabetic on your way to diabetic. And yet there are some of the plant-based folks will say, it's the meat, stupid. It's the meat. The meat is your whole problem. This lady was eating no meat at all and could hardly walk and could hardly stand. She says, I was headed for a wheelchair. And suddenly, within a short time, she brings her carbs down. Her A1C goes down. Now she can walk. She's walking 2 miles a day. Now she's riding her bike. Amazing results. It's kind of funny. There are some people on the plant-based side that say the problem is the meat. If you can just get rid of meat and meat fat, especially, if you have to eat meat at all, eat the thinnest, scrawniest, toughest meat with almost no fat at all. That might be okay occasionally if you just have a small amount. But then on the other side, you can get some of the carnivores who are almost as radical saying, it's the plants, boy. You eat plants and you'll be a diabetic like that. Boom. So the carnivores blame the plants and the plant-based blame the meat. I blame the carbs. You say, well, who are you to blame anybody? Well, I just go by what Mike tells me, and he tells me carbs are the problem. If you get some meat that's got a lot of sugar added, that could be a problem. And if you go for the plant-based and you go for the high-carb plant-based, meaning a lot of fruit, a lot of starches, a lot of potatoes, a lot of rice, that's definitely a problem. You can do plant-based and probably beat your diabetes if you know what to eat, which would mean a lot of salads and low-carb veggies and maybe some soy products and edamame, I think they call it, and tofu and so forth. So I don't blame the carbs. I don't blame the meat. I don't blame the plants. I don't blame the meat. I blame the carbs. And the reason I do is because Mike showed me. Anyway, this lady is excited. But one other thing that's so interesting is she wasn't even fully diabetic. 6.3 is not diabetic. 6.5 or higher is. And yet she was having all kinds of symptoms. The tingling fingers, the tingling toes, and could hardly walk, and just all kinds of things. Urinating constantly, getting UTIs and infections of different kinds. All those are diabetic symptoms. And she was only 6.3, wasn't even fully diabetic. And that brings about a powerful point, which is you don't even have to reach the diabetic standard of 6.5 as an A1C to have diabetic symptoms. But the other side of that coin is this. There are some people that are in the 7s, fully diabetic by the standard, and yet they don't have these symptoms. So how is it that some people can be below the diabetic range, in the 6s perhaps, and have diabetic symptoms, and others can be well above it in the 7s and not have diabetic symptoms? You say, Dennis, how do you explain that? I don't. Diabetes has a lot of mysteries to it still. I don't claim to be any expert on every facet, and there is nobody that is. I do know one thing. Carbohydrates drive high glucose, which drives high insulin, which creates a terrible problem. All right, here's one more comment quickly. Love you, Dennis. Thanks for your work. I've added some of your recipes, and along with just plain old avoiding carbs as much as possible, I'm so much improved over the last 2 weeks or so. This individual is excited about 2 weeks' progress. She says, I'm doing this with no suffering. I love that. No suffering. I feel like I'm eating very well and getting very full. Stop, rewind, eating very well, getting very full. And they mentioned that they had pancakes and sausage as per my recipe, low-carb pancakes, which would be coconut flour and I think some almond flour. And some sausage. They said, I got so full, I didn't even eat lunch. I had that for my breakfast. I didn't even eat lunch. And then I waited for supper. Well, you see, that's how a real diet that becomes a lifestyle can work for you when you're not hungry all the time. If your diet, whatever it is leaving you constantly hungry, you'll never make it. You will never succeed. You will fail. Let me say it again. F-A-I-L. You will fail if your diet is leaving you hungry all the time. This person is so excited because not only is the low-carb diet lowering their glucose and bringing about good results, and they mention how that their post-meal glucose tests are so good. And oftentimes they're just 10 or more points of a spike, which is essentially nothing. They say one time it went up, worst case, 25 points. And And they say they mentioned one time they had half of a small sweet potato, 94 before eating that meal, 115 an hour and 15 minutes later. And they say, this is my worst in several days, and it's still not too shabby. And I agree, not too shabby at all. And then they give the word, which is not an official word, W-O-O-O-O-O, buddy, woo, buddy, or whoa, buddy, whatever it is. They're excited. And they're finding out this works, and they're finding out I can eat this way. I'm enjoying it. I'm not struggling. I'm not suffering. I'm enjoying my food. I'm not getting hungry. And you know what's said behind this? They don't actually say it, but when you really get that, you will realize, I can do this. I can do this today and tomorrow, and I think I can do it next year. I think I can do it I can see myself doing this 10 years from now and beating diabetes and not being miserable. And that, my friends, is a wonderful feeling. Do you need more information and inspiration about beating diabetes? The very first line of our description is nearly always a link to our hundreds of videos toward that one subject, how to beat diabetes. Click on that link and start watching these videos. You'll be blessed and, I believe, greatly helped.